special envoy within the Secretary of State of the United States of America, and he's responsible for directing U.S. policy and projects aimed at countering anti-Semitism throughout the world. Prior to his appointment as a special envoy, he served as a deputy district attorney in Los Angeles, and he prosecuted violent crimes for more than a decade. Special Envoy Carr served, and this is also important, in the United States Army Reserves, and he has received multiple awards and commendations for his nearly 2 decades of military service in the U.S. Army. He's the son of Iraqi Jewish refugees who fled persecution in Iraq. And Special Envoy Carr also speaks Iraqi dialect of Arabic, and he also speaks Hebrew. And I think during the course of the next couple of weeks, you'll also learn about the sort of silent removal, exodus, cleansing of Mizrahi Jews from Arab countries of the region, which is a very important part of contemporary anti-Semitism. And I think I've met other special envoys, previous special envoys, and it's a privilege that Elan Carr is here with us. And I know, and I'm not saying this to be polite, I really know that Elan Carr understands it, gets it, and he's very much committed to the struggle of contemporary anti-Semitism. And as Yossi said, and as Elie Wiesel wisely taught us, that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never, ever, ever ends with Jews. Elan Carr's work is essential, and he's the man for the job. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Charles, and Carlton and Ira for all your hard work, and to all of you. And I have to tell you, first of all, if Charles wants me to be somewhere, the answer is always yes. But I'm especially honored to be here with a room full of scholars and educators and students. Because when we're talking about the fight against anti-Semitism, there is no audience more important than this one. And I will come back to that and why you are critical to turning the tide in this fight. But first I want to say something about Charles. When I accepted this appointment, going on 5 months ago, everyone said to me, have you met Charles Small yet? I said, oh, I've heard of him, but not yet, I haven't met. Well, the next person said to me, well, you have to speak to Charles. And I said, okay. The third person, finally, when we met in I think it was in New York, we became great friends and partners in this struggle. And really what I said before in the introductions when we went around the room is absolutely true. Charles is a game changer, and he's become really a thought leader internationally in this field. And I'm just so proud of our partnership and of everything you're doing and of this conference. So thank you for having me. And thank you, yeah. Just over a month and a half ago, I joined with 6 United States ambassadors in what was the first ever official United States government delegation to March of the Living. Some of you in here, I heard in the introductions, are scholars of the Holocaust. One person has done an internship in Auschwitz. But for many of these ambassadors, this was their first time there. And while these educated, sophisticated leaders certainly knew what the Holocaust was, they had never experienced it so viscerally as we did on that terrible march, where we joined arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, with thousands of students and educators and faith leaders and activists in marching that horrendous walk from Auschwitz to Birkenau. We stood inside gas chambers. We saw piles of human hair, real human hair. And then we walked the expanse and saw the enormity of the crematoria and the extermination facilities that were still there, although in ruins, destroyed by retreating Nazi forces. And we were devastated. And then, a few hours later, the 6 ambassadors and I boarded a plane and flew to Israel. And the very next evening, we were again shoulder to shoulder and arm in arm. But this time, dancing at the Kotel, the Western Wall in Jerusalem, because it was Shabbat. And we danced along with soldiers and educators and students and activists. But this time in joy. And the contrast between history's darkest moment and greatest evil and this beautiful response to evil, the joy of a modern, thriving democracy, people dancing together, celebrating the Shabbat, that contrast was searing, unforgettable, and frankly left one of the ambassadors sobbing. He was openly in tears. It is that contrast that speaks volumes into the fight that we have to fight and the mission to which we have all dedicated ourselves. I accepted my appointment at a time of shockingly rising anti-Semitism throughout the world. Jews today are attacked for being Jewish on the streets of Europe. Jewish assets, cemeteries, synagogues are vandalized, not only in Europe, in New York, in Los Angeles. Jewish kids wearing kippot are attacked even in Brooklyn. Textbooks to this day in countries allied with the United States and the United Kingdom. I'm not talking about pariah rogue enemies here, allies. Inculcate vitriolic anti-Semitism in children, which is, by the way, child abuse, and also damages an entire generation, committing them to the hatred of the Jewish people. That's happening today. And social media is boiling over with anti-Semitic hatred. The sources of what is going on today, and by the way, what is going on today truly leaves one speechless, like our professor here from Haifa, who said he struggles to find the words. We all struggle to find the words. We all struggle to find the words, especially here, especially in Europe, where it has been only 75 years since those crematoria stopped operating. And the sources of this hatred are, as we heard so powerfully from Charles and from Rabbi Zweig and from General Cooperwasser, is the radical ethnic supremacist right, the radical Israel-hating left, and radical Islam. I won't detail the particular flavors of anti-Semitism coming from each because it's been done by other speakers very effectively. But I will say this. These are three groups: the radical ethnic supremacist right, the Israel-hating far left, and radical Islam, that should hate each other more than they hate anything else on earth. And yet they are united. United in their hatred of the Jewish people. And I would argue also in one other way. United in the fundamental incompatibility of their values with everything on which the United States and the United Kingdom and many other decent, good countries in the world have been built. Fundamentally incompatible. The idea of the ethnic supremacist far right or the radical anti-Zionist left or of radical Islam is fundamentally incompatible with our countries and with Western democracy. In my first trip overseas that involved bilateral diplomatic visits on behalf of the United States, I traveled to Eastern and Central Europe to confront what is known as the problem of the far right. In Eastern and Central Europe, there are far-right movements, not in government. It's very important to say not in government, but far-right movements that are openly anti-Semitic and that embrace Nazi ideology in a way that is truly shocking. One can call them neo-Nazi movements. We see this in Poland. We see it in Hungary. I was also in Ukraine. But what I want to talk to you now is about the other side of this. I want to talk to you about what is often called the new anti-Semitism. General Cooper-Wasser actually used that term, the new anti-Semitism, and that is the anti-Semitism that clothes itself in Israel hatred. Because unlike the traditional anti-Semitism of the ethnic supremacist right, this kind of anti-Semitism is gaining wide acceptance. It is embraced in polite and impolite company, and it is expressed in a way that is opened and notorious to an extent that would have been unthinkable only a few years ago, and which is truly shocking. Now, what I'm here to tell you is that there is nothing new about this so-called new anti-Semitism. In fact, every traditional manifestation of anti-Semitism is duplicated precisely in the so-called new anti-Semitism. Let's go through it step by step. How about blood libels? The medieval, primitive, baseless blood libels against the Jewish people that Jews bake matzah with the blood of Christian children, which, by the way, justified all kinds of wholesale slaughter of Jewish communities. Baseless, ridiculous. The so-called new anti-Semitism applies medieval blood libels, not about matzah, but accusing the Jew among the states, among the countries, of perpetrating genocide, of being an apartheid regime, of infecting Palestinian children with viruses. Yes, these are actually things that are said, widely distributed and printed, by the way, in media. Blood libels then, blood libels now. How about rhetoric? The same rhetoric. A European Jewish leader recently was called a dirty Zionist, as though the substitution of the word might confuse us as to what is actually meant. Your parents fled from Iraq. Your mother fled from Iraq when she was 7. My mother fled from Iraq at around the same age. When she was a young girl, she saw her father, my grandfather, arrested. He was dragged out of the house. He still had shaving cream on his face and thrown in prison. But before he was thrown in prison, he was tried for a crime. The crime? Being a Zionist. What did that mean? He was accused of distributing Zionist material at a rally in Baghdad on such and such a date. Now let's put aside the question of whether that actually should be a crime. A very good question. But let's put that issue aside. He wasn't in Baghdad. And when his case was called, he said, "Your Honor, there must be some mistake. I was in Basra that day. I was working with British officers in the port of Basra. I can bring witnesses to prove I wasn't in Baghdad that day. You have the wrong man." The judge responded, "You are challenging the accusations against you. For you, 2 extra years in prison, beyond what you were already going to receive." And so really, the rhetoric of being a Zionist wasn't about distributing material at a rally. It was because he was a Jew. And so the same rhetoric then, the same rhetoric now. Also the same is the obsessive, compulsive hatred, the consuming hatred of the Jewish people. We see it over and over again in traditional anti-Semitism, but it also applies, as many of you know on campus, to the so-called new anti-Semitism. Again, nothing new about it. A kid at a top prestigious university gave me an answer sheet to a math class. It was an answer sheet to a problem set in math. I still have a copy. The derivative of so-and-so is such and such. The integral of such and such is so-and-so. And then it says, another day in the occupied Palestinian territory, Zionist forces murdering children. Then it goes back to math. The kid who gave this to me said, with a voice reflecting utter exhaustion, "In math class, I can't even run away from this? In math class?" That's right, in math class. Because Jew hatred is an obsessive disease. And just like it was obsessive then, it's obsessive in the new anti-Semitism. Another one, delegitimization, isolation. The Jew, the Jewish community is the outsider. The Jew is the outsider, the ominous separate other that undermines society, that threatens all of us. The same kind of delegitimization spoken today about the Jew among the countries. Another classic feature of traditional anti-Semitism is blaming Jews for the anti-Semitic response. The hatred, the violence, the pogroms, all because of something Jews did, either fictionally, blood and matzah, or actually in reality. Even Kristallnacht, the horrendous, notorious beginning of the Holocaust, even Kristallnacht was blamed on something Jews did. And by the way, something actual. No blood and matzah on this occasion. The assassination of a German diplomat by Herschel Greenspan, a Jew. But we know that just because the Nazis claim Kristallnacht was a response to something Jews did, doesn't mean we're so gullible as to believe it. We understand that Kristallnacht wasn't a response to what a Jew did, it was a response to Jews existing. Kristallnacht was part of the Nazi strategy to eradicate the Jewish people. So too, the so-called new anti-Semitism always blames Israel for the response. Sometimes fictional, sometimes actual. A community built here, a military operation there. But just because the Israel haters claim that their actions are a response to something Israel did, doesn't mean we're so gullible as to believe it. It's part of the overall strategy to wipe the Jewish state out of existence. And finally, economic strangulation and suffocation, denying the Jew economic intercourse that everyone enjoys. Kauft nicht bei Juden. We all have seen the pictures of the brown shirts holding the signs in front of Jewish shops. Well, what is BDS if not that? Don't buy from the Jew among the countries, thereby seeking to do through economic means what no military has been able to do, suffocate the Jewish state out of existence. And I want to join General Cooper-Wasser in thanking the German Bundestag for passing a law saying that BDS is anti-Semitism, and in fact saying that BDS reminds us of the Juden boycotts of the 1930s. And the German Bundestag ought to know. And so that is the so-called new anti-Semitism. And here's some very bad news for you. It's actually working. A survey recently done of Jewish college students in the United States shows that Jewish students on campuses today are less supportive of Israel than ever before, more inclined to blame Israel for problems in the Middle East than ever before, and even more apologetic for terrorism than ever before. And in the Christian evangelical community, the number one issue discussed at every conference, and I attend these conferences, is that we're losing the young people. The litmus test issue of support for Jews in Israel is being lost to the young people. I just spoke at a pro-Israel rally in Los Angeles, and an evangelical kid ran up to me and said, I'm here, I love Israel, and I'm volunteering here with some of my fellows. I said, tell me something. Matthew, is it true that young evangelical Christians are less supportive of Israel? He said to me, oh, it's absolutely true. It's all around us. I said, tell me something. Why is that? You know what he said? He said, because we also go to college. We also hear it all the time. The constant drumbeat in math class, certainly in the humanities. Constant drumbeat. We also hear it. Now think about this. Jews and evangelical Christians, those aren't just two communities. Those are the communities. If the anti-Semitic vitriol in college campuses are turning those two groups, just imagine everyone else. And lest anyone think that these effects might be short-lived or confined to that other world, the world of campus, not the world of leadership. Let me tell you about the most disturbing meeting I've had in the last 5 months. And in my business, I have a lot of disturbing meetings. But this one stands out. The most disturbing meeting was with a Labour MP, UK Labour MP, who walked out of the Labour Party. Not a Jewish woman, non-Jewish, who said, I will not sit at the same table with anti-Semites. And I met with her, And here's what she said to me. This disaster that we have in England all started on the campuses. And we did nothing because they were only students. And then it came into the Labour Party, and we did nothing because it was just the far left fringe. And today, they won and we lost, and I don't have a party I can call home anymore. And so my message to you today is that the urgency of this crisis is clear, and today we have to act to turn this tide. Not tomorrow, not next week, because there won't be a next week or a tomorrow. Today we have to turn this tide. And that the stakes could not be higher. Before I open it up for questions, Charles asked me to take your questions, and I look forward to it because this is a room of serious people, scholars and educators. I want to leave you with some good news, because there is good news, believe it or not. 3 pieces of good news. Piece of good news number 1 is because anti-Semitism has become so open and notorious, it's causing a reaction. And a lot of people, serious people in leadership, are appalled. And they are standing up and committing themselves to fight this ancient, relentless sickness that is anti-Semitism. I meet with them all the time, and they're at every level. I'm talking about heads of state and government, ministers, parliamentarians, down to local leaders, mayors, and regional coordinators. They get it, and they're passionate about it. And they speak with fire and eloquence, and they say, I'll be darned if in Europe, only a few decades after we stopped murdering these people, we're going to start this again? Hitler said, among his last words in the bunker, in 200 years, everyone will forget about this and be back to killing the Jews. Are we going to prove him to have overestimated our values? 75 years we're going to be doing this? And these leaders also understand what General Cooper-Wasser said so powerfully, which is that it's not only about protecting Jews. By the way, if fighting anti-Semitism were only about protecting Jews, that would be reason enough to do it. To protect the most persecuted, killed minority, that would be reason enough. But it isn't only about protecting Jews. It's about the society that we will build and that our children will inherit. President Trump calls anti-Semitism a vile poison, and that's what it is. It's a vile poison because every society that has imbibed it has been ruined. Anti-Semitism is human history's greatest barometer of suffering. Where it appears and where it grows leaves nothing but wreckage. It starts with the Jews, but it destroys everything. Everything good and everything decent. And that lesson does not need to be taught in Europe. And so anti-Semitism is about the future. And these leaders get it, and they say, what kind of society, what kind of country, what kind of continent do we want our kids to inherit? That's what's at stake. And so we have to spare no effort to fight and to win. And these are non-Jews. And I am so proud that among my jobs is not only to fight anti-Semites and to pressure the recalcitrant, but it's also to put the full weight of the United States behind these great friends and great allies who get it and are fighting this fight with every effort they can muster. Good news number 2 is the administration for which I work. Now, I got to tell you, there has never been a United States administration this committed to this issue, to the fight against anti-Semitism, to the support for the Jewish people throughout the world, and to support for the state of Israel. We've never had anything like this. It's not only President Trump, it's certainly him. It's Vice President Pence. It's my boss, Secretary of State Pompeo. It's National Security Advisor John Bolton. I mean, you could not have people who are more ferocious on this issue, who care more about it. And the world notices. When the president spends a chunk of the State of the Union address, the most prominent speech a president makes all year, talking about anti-Semitism, talking about how we have to tear this out of our midst, the world notices. And I'm not even talking about the senior Jewish officials in the administration, Jared Kushner, Jason Greenblatt, David Friedman, and the list goes on. We've never had anything like this. And so when I go overseas as the senior diplomatic representative of the United States on this subject, I'm taken very seriously. And when I have asks of countries, and not all of my asks are easy. Now, I'm diplomatic. I say thank you for A, B, C, D. We're thrilled, but E, F, G, H, we need to work on this. Nobody tells me no. They say, okay, let me see what I can do. And that's because they know it's not just the anti-Semitism envoy who's saying it. They know that my boss and his boss really care. And that's very good news. And good news, piece of good news number 3, and finally, is the IRA definition on anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism that General Cooper-Wasser also mentioned. Thank you for mentioning it. This is a game changer. It is a definition of anti-Semitism. It doesn't carry the force of criminal statute. It's just a definition. But it is powerful because some people are being anti-Semitic without even knowing it, or are dressing up their anti-Semitism with some one or another kind of fig leaf. But if you've got a definition, it's not a matter of your opinion. You can say to someone, look, I'm not calling you an anti-Semite. By the way, I never call anyone an anti-Semite. I say, what you just said is anti-Semitic. Do you know that? And I'm not saying, it's not a matter of my opinion. It's defined as anti-Semitic. Look at the definition. And the definition includes demonizing the state of Israel, minimizing or denying the Holocaust, applying a different standard to Israel that you apply to other countries. This is actually part of the definition. And that's very, very powerful. The United States has adopted it, the United Kingdom has adopted it, France has adopted it, and many other countries. In fact, the OSCE voted 56-1 to adopt the IRA definition on anti-Semitism. And let me tell you, that body doesn't agree on much. And so this is the good news. And I have no doubt that with committed friends like you, with leaders like Charles, with people like Prime Minister May and President Macron and Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump who really care, we are going to win. We are going to be able to turn the tide. If I weren't an optimist, I wouldn't have taken this job. We really can roll this back. And the stakes could not be higher. If we do, if we work together, shoulder to shoulder and arm, like we marched a few months ago, if we do that, we will build a better world and bequeath to our children and to our grandchildren the kind of future that they so richly deserve. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, Charles. And now I'd be happy to take your questions. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Hi, yes, Mr. Carr, thank you for being here. I'm so appreciative of all the speakers for your time. I'm a U.S. citizen, and I am most interested in your thoughts on white nationalism in terms of the Trump campaign and the Trump stance, and how that relates to anti-Semitism. And I'm specifically referencing the beginnings of genocide and how it starts with hate.
No question. I couldn't agree with you more. I think white nationalism is what I talked about before, the ethnic supremacist right. The reason why I don't say white is because ethnic supremacism can be expressed in many forms. It can be Arab ethnic supremacism. It can be white ethnic supremacism. But ethnic supremacism, like what you said in the back about the other, about hatred of the other, is evil and leads to hatred, and hatred leads to violence. There's no question. I spoke at the funeral of Lori Kay, who was murdered in Poway on Shabbat because she was a Jew. 6 months to the day after 11 worshipers were murdered on Shabbat in Pittsburgh. And what I said in my eulogy of Lori, and what I was authorized to say, by the way, I was there representing the entire administration, not just the State Department, the entire administration. What I was authorized to say by the White House is that we are at war with white supremacism. And we are at war with white supremacism because, like I said before, it's not only about the Jews or about African Americans or about Latinos. White supremacism, ethnic supremacism, is fundamentally incompatible with what America has been built on. In fact, America was built by people who left the old world because they didn't want any more of the blood libels and the holy wars and the butchery and the savagery. Those are the founding fathers who built America. And so, truly, this is a war. President Trump said after the Pittsburgh murders, he said something that no leader in the world has ever said, which is, if you go after the Jews, if you seek the destruction of the Jews, we will seek your destruction. That is a shocking statement. No leader has ever said that. That kind of commitment to fighting this is something that is deeply needed and very urgent. And rising ethnic supremacism is a threat in the United States. It's growing. It's a threat in Europe. It's growing. And it's a threat in other parts of the world. And we have to come together and fight it. I'll say this before I turn to another question. I never rank sources of anti-Semitism in the urgency of the fight or in importance. I said there are three sources: radical left anti-Zionists, radical right ethnic supremacists, and radical Islam. I never rank them. And the reason why I don't rank them is in our polarized political climate, anti-Semitism is often weaponized, used as a means of political advantage. So I never rank them. The way I say it is, look, Jew hatred is Jew hatred. And I don't care what ideological clothing it wears. I don't care what part of the ideological spectrum it comes from. We've got to fight it. It's evil, and we've got to defeat it. Yes, sir. You, yeah.
I'm an American, and I teach in an English program, so a couple of things that really jumped out at me. The condition of the college campus and your remarks about the labor party. In the American context, do you think that Israel can remain a bipartisan, can sustain bipartisan support? And what about the college campuses? The humanities are in such deep trouble. Can they be reformed?
Great questions. So let me first of all say about Israel remaining a bipartisan issue. Thank God for all of the problems in the United States today. The United States is still the most philo-Semitic country in world history. There's no question about it. You see that in polls and surveys, and it is quite a remarkable feature of the United States. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't trouble brewing. That doesn't mean there aren't trends, and that doesn't mean that we all don't have to be vigilant in making sure it continues that way. If we're not vigilant, it won't, but so far it still is. Democratic members of Congress are overwhelmingly philo-Semitic and pro-Israel. That's still the case. If you look at the leadership of committees in the House, incredibly pro-Israel, unabashedly pro-Israel, and pro-Jewish, philo-Semitic. However, there is a problem in the radical left. And the radical left is growing and expanding and becoming widely accepted. And what that means is that creates enormous pressure, electoral pressure, on Democratic members of Congress and, in fact, Democratic presidential candidates. And so the key here, you can't just say, well, that's the fringe or that's the far left. It's a real problem when you've got a substantial constituency that has adopted hatred of the state of Israel or anti-Semitism in another form. That has to be addressed. Just like, by the way, a large constituency that hates African Americans or hates Latinos, that has to be addressed. Or you're going to have that find its expression in the electorate. It hasn't yet, but it may well soon, be soon. And that's why this has to be addressed head on. Your second question.
Well, you spoke movingly about college students and the campus as a source of...
Can the tide be turned? Oh, for humanities departments, right. So absolutely. So I'm actually having a meeting on this at the White House on Wednesday, precisely on this subject. I will tell you that one of the the great appointments made by President Trump is for the Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights. The Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights, Ken Marcus, is an anti-BDS activist. There is nobody better than he, nobody. And he's in charge of that portfolio. And so I'm just thrilled by that. So we have partners in the administration. We have people at the Department of Justice and Treasury looking at this as well domestically. So this is a full court press, and it needs to be addressed. By the way, the hostile educational climate created on college campuses in the United States is not only unpleasant, it's actually illegal. It violates the Civil Rights Act, because for the Jewish people as an ethnic minority, to have to go to school in a hostile climate is actually violates federal civil rights standards. And so there's no question this needs to be addressed, and I look forward to working with our partners in the administration to address it.
This is going to be the final question.
Final question. So you pick the final question. You're the boss.
What do you think about Steve Bannon and his movements?
So what do I think about Stephen Bannon in what respect?
And about his movement with the leaders of the right?
Well, is that related to anti-Semitism, your question? Okay, so I'll tell you about Steve Bannon, and I'm not his lawyer, but what I'll tell you about Steve Bannon, he's very controversial, but he's not an anti-Semite, and that much is clear. I actually know Jews who've worked with him at Breitbart and who know him very well who hate him. And they say, I hate the guy, he's not an anti-Semite. You cannot call Steve Bannon an anti-Semite. Now, is he controversial? Yes. Is he is he a right-wing activist? Yes. But it's very important not to call every right-wing activist an anti-Semite. Some right-wing activists are, some right-wing activists aren't. By the way, this is very important in another context, and I'll end on this. And I see this often in my work in Eastern Europe, where you've got right-of-center nationalist governments in Poland and in Hungary. When there is a rise in right-wing nationalism, there will almost always be a concomitant rise, because rising tide raises all boats, a concomitant rise in ethnic supremacism, which is very dangerous. However, it is deeply important that we draw a distinction between nationalism, which can be benign, sometimes isn't, but can be benign, and ethnic supremacism, which is evil and despicable. The reason why it's very, very important to draw that distinction is because in not drawing that distinction, we give ammunition to anti-Semitism on the left, which specifically opposes the Jewish people because, in their view, we're not a people. The idea that Judaism is a religion only and not an ethnic national group, and therefore not entitled to a nationalist movement of self-determination, which is what Zionism is, therefore not entitled to a nation state of the Jewish people, is given ammunition when we brand all nationalism as racism or as Nazism. What about Zionism? Zionism is nationalism. By definition, it is the national movement of the Jewish people, which incidentally did not start in 1948 or with the first Zionist Congress. It comes from Genesis, when God tells Abraham, go forth to a land that I will show you. And when Moses led the children of Israel through the desert to the promised land. That's what Zionism is. It is as old as Judaism. And it is a central defining feature of what Judaism is. One cannot separate the two. And that's why anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, because Zionism is not a political opinion. It is an essential, intrinsic part of what the Jewish people are and what the Jewish religion professes. And so we never want to give ammunition to those who attack Judaism from the nationalist perspective, from the anti-nationalist perspective. And so we've got to distinguish between nationalism, which certainly can be benign, and ethnic supremacism, which always is evil and despicable. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate all of your good work, and good luck on the rest of the conference.
Great.